The Veyari were one of the most powerful and ancient species in the galaxy. Their technology was unmatched, their warriors feared, and their empire stretched across entire star systems. Despite all their strength, the Veyari had always sought peace with humanity, a younger species, full of promise but much weaker in comparison. And so, a treaty had been formed, a pact that would bind their fates forever. This pact, made many years ago, was not one born of love or mutual understanding, but one made to keep peace. The Veyari king, King Zorth, had promised his unborn daughter to a human. The human chosen for this bond was a young diplomat named Ethan Carter, an ambitious but skeptical man from Earth. As a child, Ethan had never imagined his future would be tied to an alien princess, especially one he would never meet until adulthood. Now, years later, Ethan stood in the grand halls of the Veyari Palace, his heart pounding as he gazed up at the towering structures that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the stars. He had always imagined the Veyari as cold, calculating beings, but nothing had prepared him for the reality of their world. The marble walls gleamed with an eerie light, reflecting the advanced technology that filled the space. He was not just here to negotiate. He was here because of an ancient promise, one he had no say in. "Welcome, Ethan Carter," the voice of Princess Xena echoed through the palace. Ethan turned to find a figure silhouetted against a massive window, her presence as commanding as the space around her. Princess Xena, with her striking silver hair and piercing violet eyes, was nothing like he had imagined. The Veyari were known for their beauty, but this was something different. Xena was a force of nature, radiating power and strength, and it was clear that she was not someone to be easily controlled. "Your presence honors our people," Xena continued, stepping forward. Her voice was firm, but there was something in her eyes, something almost defiant. It made Ethan uneasy, and he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of tension between them. The moment their eyes met, Xena's expression darkened. She looked at him as if he were some strange, unwanted creature, and Ethan couldn't help but feel a chill run down his spine. This wasn't how he had imagined meeting her. There was no warmth, no welcome. Instead, there was a coldness that seemed to echo through the grand halls. "Do you know why you're here?" Xena's voice was soft, but the weight of her words was clear. She had not yet spoken to him as a human, only as a symbol of the ancient agreement. Ethan nodded, though his mind raced with the uncertainty of it all. He had come to represent Earth's desire for peace, but this felt like something else entirely. "I know I was chosen," Ethan replied carefully, "but I did not come here to be forced into a promise made before I was even born." Xena's gaze hardened at his words, and for a moment, Ethan wondered if he had crossed a line. But the princess only nodded slowly, as if considering his response. "We Veyari do not break promises," she said. "And this promise was made long before either of us had a say in it. You may think it strange, but the fate of our people has always been entwined with yours. This union was forged to protect peace. You and I, we are simply pieces in a larger game." Ethan felt the weight of her words. The idea of being a pawn in some larger political game was something he had feared, but hearing it from Xena's lips made it all too real. His mind raced as he tried to grasp the implications. Was he truly just a part of this plan? Or was there something more? His gaze met Xena's again, and for a brief moment, he saw a flicker of something in her eyes, something he couldn't quite place. It was not hatred, nor was it indifference. It was confusion, perhaps even frustration. Xena turned away from him, her regal stride making her seem even more imposing. "Come," she said, "you will meet my father, the king. He will explain more about this union and what it means for the future of both our peoples." As they walked through the palace, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. He had come here to ensure peace, to represent humanity's best hopes for the future, but everything felt uncertain. How could two people who had never met, who had never agreed to this arrangement, possibly be the foundation for peace between two vastly different species. The Veyari king awaited them in the heart of the palace, a towering figure whose presence was as overwhelming as the palace itself. King Zorith, with his long golden hair and dark green eyes, exuded authority and power. His gaze flicked between Ethan and Xena, as if assessing the situation. "You must understand, Ethan Carter," King Zorith began, his voice deep and commanding. "This union is more than a personal matter. It is the future of both our species. The peace we have maintained for generations depends on it." Ethan nodded, but in the back of his mind, a question lingered. Was this truly the path to peace, or was he being dragged into something much more complicated than he could ever imagine? Days passed, and the uneasy tension between Ethan and Xena showed no signs of easing. Their meetings were frequent, but the air between them was always thick with unspoken words. They sat together in the grand hall, side by side, but it was clear neither of them was comfortable. King Zorith had insisted they spend time together, hoping to force a connection that neither of them wanted. Ethan knew that they were supposed to bond, learn about each other, and accept their fate, but everything about this situation felt wrong. Xena remained distant, her pride a barrier that kept her from opening up. Ethan could feel the weight of her resistance. It wasn't just anger, it was something deeper, something that spoke of a broken heart. She was as trapped in this situation as he was. But no matter how much they were forced together, they couldn't seem to find common ground. One day, they were taken to a beautiful garden, filled with alien plants that Ethan had never seen before. Tall trees with glowing fruit and flowers that seemed to hum in the breeze surrounded them. The place was peaceful, almost serene, but the peace didn't reach their hearts. Ethan glanced over at Xena. She stood by the edge of a crystal-clear pond, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. The sunlight caught the silver strands of her hair, giving her an ethereal look. For a moment, she seemed less like the powerful princess and more like a young woman lost in thought, weighed down by the burden of her duty. He walked over slowly, unsure of what to say. The silence between them was always so heavy. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "I know this isn't easy for either of us." Xena didn't look at him, but she nodded, her fingers lightly tracing the surface of the water. "You don't understand," she said softly. "This isn't just about us. It's about my people, about the peace we must maintain. If we fail, everything is at risk." Ethan felt a pang of sympathy for her. She had been born into this life, burdened with the responsibilities of her people, just as he had been burdened with the expectations of his own. Still, the idea of being forced into a marriage or alliance like this was not something he could easily accept. "I understand the need for peace," Ethan replied. "But I don't think peace can be built on something that wasn't chosen. It has to come from both sides, from understanding each other, not just doing what's expected." Xena turned to face him then, her violet eyes meeting his. For the first time, he saw a flicker of vulnerability in her gaze. She didn't speak immediately, but the tension between them seemed to soften just a little. "I was never given a choice," she said quietly. "From the moment I was born, my life was decided for me. I am not just a princess. I am the key to our survival. My marriage to you is the foundation of that survival. But that doesn't mean I have to like it." Ethan didn't know what to say to that. He had never been in a situation like this, never had his life planned out by someone else. The weight of her words hung in the air, and he could see the deep sadness in her eyes. "I never wanted this either," Ethan said, his voice more honest than he had intended. "I didn't ask for this union. I was just doing my job as a diplomat. But now, it feels like there's more at stake than just politics." Xena's gaze softened, and for a brief moment, Ethan thought she might say something more. But instead, she simply nodded. "I suppose we are both prisoners of circumstance." The conversation turned quiet again, but this time, it wasn't filled with anger or resentment. There was a new understanding between them, one that neither had expected to find. They weren't enemies, nor were they friends, But they were two people caught in a situation neither of them had chosen. Over the next few days, their interactions grew less tense. They still didn't talk much, but there was a shift. Ethan noticed that Xena was watching him more closely, as if studying him, trying to understand this strange human. And for his part, Ethan couldn't help but feel an unexpected respect for her strength and poise. She had been raised to rule, to carry the weight of her people's future on her shoulders. That was something he could understand. One evening, they stood side by side in the balcony overlooking the city below. The lights of the Veyari capital twinkled like stars, casting a soft glow over the landscape. It was breathtaking, alien, yet beautiful in its own way. "You know," Ethan said, breaking the silence, "I never thought I'd be here. Not like this." Xena glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "Neither did I." They stood together, the night settling around them. There was still so much between them, so much uncertainty, so much history that neither of them could escape. But for the first time, Ethan began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was a chance that something good could come from this. A chance for them both to change the course of their fates, even if it was just a small step. Xena finally spoke again, her voice quieter than usual. "We still have a long way to go." Ethan nodded. "I know, but maybe we don't have to do it alone." And for the first time since they had met, Xena smiled. A small, hesitant smile, but a smile nonetheless. It was the first sign of warmth he had seen from her, and it made him wonder if perhaps, just perhaps, the bond they were building was not as impossible as he had once believed. The days continued to pass, each one bringing Ethan and Xena a little closer to understanding one another. It wasn't exactly friendship, but the awkwardness between them had begun to fade. Conversations, once forced and stiff, now flowed a little easier, though there were still moments of silence. They learned more about each other, about their respective worlds, and despite the initial bitterness, something was beginning to change. One afternoon, as they walked through the palace gardens, Xena pointed to a small, shimmering flower that bloomed in a patch of sunlight. "That flower," she said, her voice soft, "is rare even among the Veyari. It only blooms once every 100 years." Ethan squinted at the delicate petals, which seemed to glow in the light. "It's beautiful," he said, genuinely impressed. "I don't think I've ever seen anything like it." Xena turned to him, a small smile touching her lips. "The beauty of this planet is often hidden, just like people." Her words were quiet, but there was meaning behind them. Sometimes it takes time to see things for what they truly are. Ethan considered her words, his gaze moving from the flower to her face. Her expression had softened since their first meeting, and for the first time, he saw a glimpse of the person beyond the princess. She wasn't just a symbol of political power. She was an individual, burdened by expectations, just like him. "I used to think the universe was simple," Ethan said, "that people were either good or bad, and that everything could be figured out easily. But I've learned that there's always more to the story, more than what we're told." Xena's eyes met his, and for a brief moment, it was as if the distance between them had disappeared. She nodded. "I know that feeling. As a child, I was taught that the fate of my people rested on my shoulders. It was not something I could choose. But I've realized, my life is not just for the Veyari. It's mine too." Ethan felt a surge of empathy. He knew what it was like to feel as though your future had been decided for you, forced to play a role you didn't choose. He had never thought much about Xena's life before now, but hearing her speak about it made him see her in a different light. They walked in silence for a while, each lost in their thoughts. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm golden light over everything. The palace was quiet, the sounds of the bustling city below muted by the height. It was peaceful, and for the first time, Ethan felt like he could breathe in this foreign world. "I never thought I'd find peace here," he admitted, breaking the silence. Xena glanced at him, a thoughtful look on her face. "Nor did I. But perhaps for the first time, I feel like I'm allowed to choose my own path. Ethan raised an eyebrow. You mean with the whole peace treaty thing? She hesitated, then nodded. Yes, but also with you. With everything that's happened. Maybe there's more to this, to us, than just what was promised. Her words surprised him. He had always thought of this union as something forced, something neither of them wanted. But now, with Sina opening up, he saw that maybe there was room for them to find a way forward, one that wasn't dictated by their past. Sina's voice was quieter now, almost uncertain. I spent my whole life preparing for a future that was already planned out. But now, standing here, I wonder, is this my life to live, or is it just a story written by others? Ethan paused, carefully considering her words. He understood that feeling. They both had been forced into roles they didn't ask for, but unlike Sina, he hadn't had the weight of an entire species resting on his shoulders. His role was simpler, at least in his mind. I think we both have the power to change our story, he said, his voice steady. Maybe we can't control everything, but we can choose how we face it. She looked at him, and for a moment, their eyes locked. There was a new understanding between them, something deeper than before. This union, this political arrangement, was more than just two people meeting. It was about their choices, their willingness to forge a new path together. I never asked for this, Sina said, her voice quieter now. But maybe, just maybe, there's something worth fighting for. Ethan smiled slightly. I never asked for it either, but I'm willing to find out what that is. The sun had almost set, and the sky was painted in shades of orange and purple. The garden around them seemed to glow even brighter in the fading light. Ethan and Sina stood there for a while, neither of them speaking, but the weight between them had shifted. It wasn't gone completely, but it was different now. For the first time, there was hope. Maybe they couldn't change the world with a single conversation, but they could change their own story. Together, they could find their way through this, step by step. The days that followed were quieter. Ethan and Sina spent more time together, but there was something different now. The walls that had once stood between them had begun to crack, even if only slightly. They still didn't speak of the future, of what this union truly meant, but the conversations they had seemed to matter more than they had before. Sina still carried the weight of her people's expectations on her shoulders, but when she was with Ethan, there were moments when she let that burden slip, just for a little while. Ethan, too, found himself thinking less about the political situation and more about the person he was growing to understand. One evening, they stood on a balcony that overlooked the city. The lights of the Veyari capital sparkled in the distance, and the air was warm, filled with the sounds of the night. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a silver glow over everything. It was beautiful, serene, even, and for the first time, Ethan didn't feel out of place. I used to wonder what it would be like to see this city at night, he said, his gaze on the sparkling lights below. Sina, standing beside him, looked out as well, but her thoughts seemed far away. It's different when you grow up with it, she said quietly. You forget the beauty in it. It becomes something you just see, something you've always known. Ethan nodded. He understood that feeling. When you were used to something, you didn't always notice the small details that made it special. Maybe that was how Xena had come to feel about her world, something she had always known, but never truly looked at. It's easy to forget what matters, he said after a pause. To forget what's right in front of you. Xena turned to face him. Is that how you feel? That the Veyari are making a mistake? That this union is the wrong choice? Ethan wasn't sure how to answer. He had thought about it a lot. About the peace treaty, about the weight of their connection, about the future they were supposed to build together. He had thought about how this could change everything for both their worlds. But he knew that everything they did had consequences, not just for them, but for their people. I don't know, he said finally. It's not that it's the wrong choice. It's just that I don't know if we can make it work. We don't know each other well enough. We haven't even started to figure out what's real. Xena met his eyes, And you think we can't? She seemed almost daring him to admit that he didn't believe in it. Ethan took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the question. I think it's worth trying. There was a long pause, and Xena's expression softened. She nodded slowly. You're right. We can't expect everything to fall into place right away. But maybe we can start with trust. Ethan blinked. Trust. It was a word that had carried so much weight for him, especially in a situation like this. Trust. He repeated, almost to himself. That's a big word. It's the only way we'll get anywhere, she said. Her voice was firm, yet there was an understanding behind it. If we're going to make this work, we need to trust each other. We need to believe that what we do now will have a positive effect on our worlds, not just for us, but for everyone. Ethan turned to her, taking in the sincerity in her eyes. She was right. Trust was the key. Without it, they would always be strangers to each other, bound only by duty and obligation. But with it, maybe they could find something real, something worth fighting for. Unwilling to try, Ethan said after a long moment, I don't have all the answers, but I'll try. Xena smiled, a rare, genuine smile that lit up her face. For the first time, Ethan saw her not as a princess or a ruler, but as a person who was just as uncertain as he was, just as lost in this world of politics and expectations. In that moment, they were no longer two people bound by duty. They were two people who had taken the first step towards something deeper. The following days were filled with small moments of understanding. They worked together to learn about each other's cultures, their differences, and similarities. Xena told Ethan about the history of her people, their struggles, their victories. Ethan shared stories about Earth, about how humans had built their civilizations from the ground up, fighting through countless challenges. As their conversations continued, they began to see the world through each other's eyes. It wasn't always easy, and sometimes the differences between them felt like walls they couldn't break down. But each time they spoke, each time they shared something personal, the bond between them grew a little stronger. One evening, as they sat together in a quiet room in the palace, Xena asked, Do you think it's possible for two people from different worlds to make something work? Ethan looked at her, his gaze steady. I think it's possible, but it's going to take time. It's going to take trust and understanding and a lot of hard work. Xena nodded. Then we'll take it one step at a time. And for the first time, Ethan believed that maybe, just maybe, they could build something real. It wouldn't be easy, and it might take more time than either of them expected. But the foundation was there, and that was all that mattered. They didn't have all the answers, but together, they were beginning to find their way. The tension between Ethan and Princess Xena had only grown since their first meeting. The moment they had stepped into the Grand Council chamber, a vast room with walls of polished stone and ceilings that stretched high into the sky, it was clear that neither of them was happy about the situation. Xena, standing tall and regal, glared at Ethan as if he were a stranger she could not tolerate. Ethan, in turn, felt a deep unease about the bond they were forced into. As they waited for King Zorith, the Veyari king, to speak, Ethan couldn't help but feel like a pawn in a game he didn't fully understand. This union between him and Xena, promised long before either of them had been born, felt like a weight that neither of them could escape. The king's words, though full of grandeur and power, did nothing to ease Ethan's confusion. What kind of peace could be built on something so unnatural? When King Zorith finally spoke, his voice was deep and full of authority. This union is not a personal matter, he said, his eyes fixed firmly on Ethan. It is the foundation of peace between our people. The Veyari have no enemies in the galaxy, but the humans, your species is still young, still unpredictable. This bond between you and Xena is to ensure our continued peace. It is something that must be respected. But Ethan could not shake the growing sense of discomfort. He had been sent here as a diplomat, a representative of Earth's future hopes for peace, not as a symbol of an old agreement made before he was born. "Respect is earned, not demanded," Ethan replied, his voice steady despite the growing tension. "This union is forced upon us. How can we build peace if it begins with an agreement neither of us chose?" Zaina narrowed her violet eyes at him. The defiance in her expression was unmistakable. "You do not understand," she said, her voice cold. "The Veyari do not break promises. Your people may find it difficult to understand, but this is about more than just the two of us. Our species' history is long, and our ways are not yours to question." Ethan stood his ground. "I'm not here to question your ways, Zaina. But this union, this idea of being forced into something that's not ours to choose, it feels wrong. It's not how peace should begin." Zaina took a step forward, her voice rising. "Then you are a fool," she spat, though the bitterness in her tone seemed to falter for a moment. She was angry, but something deeper was hiding beneath that anger. Ethan could see it in her eyes: frustration, confusion, maybe even fear. Before either of them could say more, King Zorith raised a hand, silencing them both. "Enough," he said, his voice like thunder. "I understand your frustrations, Ethan Carter, and I know my daughter is not pleased with this arrangement, but it is the way of things. The Veyari are a proud people, and we keep our word. We do not back down." Ethan, now more determined than ever, met the king's gaze with resolve. "I understand your customs, but you're asking us to sacrifice something vital, our freedom. How can anyone truly choose peace when they are forced into it?" Zaina's eyes flickered, almost as if she was thinking about what Ethan had said. But before she could respond, the king spoke again. "You will spend time together," he said. "Learn about each other. That is all I ask. Only then will you understand the importance of this bond." Ethan felt his anger rise. "So we're supposed to just accept this? No questions asked?" He looked at Zaina, but she didn't meet his gaze. She was still staring at the ground, her hands clenched at her sides. Ethan could tell she didn't like this any more than he did. King Zorith remained calm, his eyes unwavering. "Yes, that is the way it must be. You are both integral to the future of our peoples. What is a little sacrifice for the greater good?" It was clear that the king's decision was final, and neither Ethan nor Zaina had any say in it. The bond between them was not just a political arrangement. It was the future of both species, a symbol of peace that neither could escape, or so the king believed. As they left the council chamber, Ethan couldn't help but feel trapped. The Veyari were a powerful people, and their word was law. There seemed to be no room for discussion, no room for choice. He glanced over at Zaina, and for a brief moment, their eyes locked. There was something in her expression, something almost human, something that made Ethan wonder if she was feeling the same way. She didn't want this either. Without speaking a word, they walked in silence. The weight of their situation hung between them like a cloud. Neither of them was ready to accept what had been decided for them, but neither could deny the growing tension, the undeniable connection that seemed to pull them together despite their resistance. Ethan knew he couldn't simply accept the fate handed to him. He wasn't here to be a pawn in someone else's game. And Zaina, for all her pride and power, was not going to let this union be something forced upon her, no matter what the king said. They would find a way to change things, together or not at all. The days continued to pass slowly, each one bringing them closer to a future neither Ethan nor Zaina could fully predict. They had learned to find comfort in each other's company, yet the weight of the looming decision was never far from their minds. Would they be able to unite their worlds, as their leaders had promised? Could they overcome the deep divides that existed between their people? As time went on, Zaina began to open up more. She told Ethan about her fears, her hopes for her people, and how deeply she cared for her world. Her strength was not just in her position as a princess, but in her conviction to do what was right for her people. Ethan admired that strength, and yet he could sense the burden she carried every day. But still, there was something more in her eyes, a vulnerability that she hadn't shown to anyone else. She had come to trust him more than she ever thought possible. Ethan's honesty, his willingness to share his world and his experiences, had made her feel like she wasn't alone in this. The walls had come down between them, piece by piece, and though they still had much to learn, the trust they had built was undeniable. One evening, they walked together through the royal gardens, a quiet space where the sounds of the palace were left behind. The plants around them glowed softly under the moonlight, and the air was cool and refreshing. It was peaceful here, and for a moment, Ethan felt like nothing else mattered. "I never imagined I'd be here," Ethan said, his hands in his pockets as he glanced at Sena. "Not like this, not with you. I thought the Veyari were just different. I didn't understand your culture, your history." Xena smiled faintly. "We are different, but not so different that we cannot learn from each other." Her gaze turned toward the distant horizon. "I used to think I had everything figured out, that my duty to my people was all that mattered. But now I'm not so sure. I've learned so much from you, Ethan." Ethan turned his head to look at her, surprised. "From me? I'm just a guy from Earth. I don't know much about the way things work here." "You've shown me something important," she continued, her voice steady. "You've shown me what it means to care for someone, not because it's expected, but because it's real. You made me realize that it's okay to have doubt, to not have all the answers. And maybe that's how we'll find the right path forward." Ethan felt a sense of relief wash over him. He had been so unsure about his place in this situation, unsure of what his role was meant to be. But hearing her say that made him feel like maybe he was doing something right. Maybe together, they could make a difference. As they walked deeper into the garden, they found a quiet bench beneath a flowering tree. The night was peaceful, and for a while, they simply sat in silence, enjoying the calm. The gentle rustle of the leaves above them was the only sound. It was a perfect moment, a pause in the chaos that had surrounded them for so long. "I think we've made progress," Xena said after a while, breaking the silence. "But there's still so much to do, so much to prove, not just to our people, but to ourselves." Ethan nodded. He agreed with her. They had come a long way, but the journey ahead was still uncertain. He didn't know what would happen when they went back to their respective worlds. He didn't know if their people would accept the changes that they were beginning to forge. "I think we can do it," he said quietly. "We've got something worth fighting for, right? We just need to figure out how to make it work." Xena glanced at him, her eyes soft. "I believe that too. I don't know what the future holds, but I know that we have to try. For all the people who are counting on us." There was a long pause before Xena spoke again, her voice a little more hesitant. "But what about you, Ethan? Do you think you can live here with my people with me? I know it's a lot to ask, and I don't want to pressure you. I just don't want to lose what we've built." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. It was the question he had been avoiding, the one he hadn't wanted to face. He had thought about it often, about his life on Earth, his family, his friends. Could he really leave all that behind for a life he didn't fully understand? But then he looked at Sena, at the woman who had taught him so much, who had trusted him when no one else would. Her presence, her kindness, the way she had opened up to him in ways he never expected. It was impossible to ignore how deeply he felt for her. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice filled with uncertainty. "But I do know this. I don't want to lose you either. I'm willing to try. I'm willing to figure it out, no matter how difficult it may seem." Sena smiled, her eyes shining with a mixture of relief and hope. "That's all I can ask for." They sat there for a while longer, each lost in their thoughts, but both of them feeling the weight of the decision ahead. But in that moment, they knew that whatever happened, they would face it together. The road ahead was long, and it would not be easy, but they were no longer strangers. They were allies, partners in this strange, uncertain world. And that was a start. The day had finally arrived. The moment of truth was upon them, and it was now or never. Ethan and Sena stood side by side, looking out over the vast expanse of the royal grounds. The air was thick with tension, but there was also a sense of anticipation. They were about to face their people, two worlds on the brink of something monumental. It was the culmination of everything they had worked for, everything they had hoped for. Xena adjusted her gown, its shimmering fabric catching the light of the twin suns. Despite her outward composure, Ethan could see the nervousness in her eyes. This wasn't just about her, or even them. It was about two civilizations coming together in a way that had never been done before. It was a chance for peace, for unity, and for something greater than they could have ever imagined. "Are you ready?" Ethan asked, his voice calm but filled with the weight of the moment. Xena nodded slowly, her gaze steady. "As ready as I'll ever be." They walked toward the grand hall, where the leaders of both their worlds awaited. The tension in the air was palpable as they entered the hall, the silence deafening. Ethan could feel the eyes of hundreds of alien diplomats and human officials on them as they made their way to the center of the room. The room was filled with the hum of whispered conversations, but the moment Xena spoke, everything fell silent. "My people," she began, her voice clear and unwavering. "We stand at a crossroads today. Our future depends on the choices we make in this room. We have long been divided, separated by distance, by culture, by history. But today, we have the chance to change that. We have the chance to create a future where both our worlds can thrive together." Ethan stood by her side, watching the crowd. There was an air of skepticism in the room, but there was also something else, curiosity. They had all come to see what Xena and Ethan had been working toward, and now they were here, ready to witness the next chapter of their story. Xena's eyes met Ethan's for a brief moment, and he smiled. It was a small gesture, but it was enough to reassure her. This was it. This was the moment where everything they had worked for would either fall apart or come together. The Veyari leaders were the first to speak, their voices cold and cautious. "You wish to unite our people with the humans, Princess Xena. After everything that has happened, you truly believe they are ready to share our world, to stand by our side." Xena didn't flinch at the harshness in their words. Instead, she stood taller, her voice filled with conviction. "I don't just believe it. I know it. And the human you see beside me is a symbol of that belief. He has shown me that we are more alike than we are different. We can build something greater together, not apart." The humans in the room murmured, their faces filled with uncertainty. It was a moment of tension, one that could easily turn sour if not handled with care. But Ethan could sense that there was a growing understanding among the crowd. They were beginning to see what Xena had seen, a future not just of survival, but of collaboration and shared prosperity. "The question is," Xena continued, turning her gaze to the humans, "are we willing to take that first step together?" There was a long pause before a voice spoke from the back of the room. It was one of the older human diplomats, a man who had long opposed the idea of an alliance with the Veyari. His voice, once filled with disdain, was now softer, more thoughtful. "Maybe it's time we stop looking at the differences and start looking at the possibilities," he said, his words carrying weight. "If the princess and Ethan can stand together, maybe we should be able to do the same." The room grew silent as the words sank in. Ethan could see the shift in the room. People were beginning to question their assumptions. They were starting to realize that this was about more than politics or history. It was about people and the choices they made for the future. Xena turned to Ethan, her face softening. "I didn't know if they would accept this," she said quietly, just loud enough for him to hear. "I didn't know if my people would ever understand." Ethan reached out and gently took her hand. "You've already made them understand, Xena. You've already shown them what's possible." For the first time since they had entered the room, the atmosphere shifted. The tension that had once gripped everyone started to dissipate, replaced by a sense of cautious optimism. There was still work to be done, of course. The road ahead would be long and filled with challenges, but for the first time, the possibility of success felt real. The leaders of both worlds began to speak, one by one, their voices echoing in the room. Each one spoke of the importance of unity, of the need to break down old barriers and build new ones based on understanding and cooperation. They spoke of trade, of shared knowledge, and of the many ways their people could help one another. When the speeches ended, Sena and Ethan stood before the crowd, holding hands, their faces filled with hope. It wasn't just about them anymore. It was about everyone in the room and the people they represented. "We may have started as strangers, but we are no longer strangers," Sena said, her voice ringing with certainty. "Together, we are stronger." The room erupted in applause, and for the first time, Ethan felt like he truly belonged. He had crossed a galaxy, left his home, and found a new family. And it wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something much bigger. It was about a future built on trust, understanding, and the strength to face whatever came next, together. As the applause continued, Sena turned to Ethan, her eyes filled with gratitude. "We did it," she whispered, and for the first time, Ethan truly believed it. Together, they had changed the course of history.